Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all. My name is Noemi Crespo-Rice, and I serve here as Assistant Dean of Student Affairs, and I also serve as the SICE co-chair of the SICE Diversity Council. So I just want, on behalf of the leadership of this school, on behalf of our committee, I just want to welcome you all. I see lots of familiar faces and also unfamiliar faces, so happy to have you here and come support our events. So I'm here to introduce our keynote and our panelists, but before I do so, I thought I'd share a little funny story because I thought it might make you smile and set the mood for today's conversation. So I have a 3-year-old in preschool, as those of you who know me well know. And when I picked her up last Tuesday, one of her teachers says to me, "Is Soyla a Beyonce fan?" And I'm like, turning red. I'm like, I don't know what these teachers are thinking of here. I'm like, if she is, that's news to me. I didn't know Soyla was a Beyonce fan. So she said, well, apparently she's been walking around the school singing, "Who run the world? Girls, who run the world?" Yes, I see some of you dancing. And I was so red in the face when she told me. I said, well, no, we don't really listen to Beyonce at home. But, you know, when I got in my car, I felt so great that my little 3-year-old was walking around her preschool empowering other little young girls and boys about women's empowerment. And just one of that proud mommy moments. So of course, every day she's like, "Mommy, can we hear Who Run the World?" I'm like, okay. Of course, my 5-year-old son was not as impressed at all. He's like, "Can we shut off that song now?" So anyway, for today, who's running the world at SICE? We have an amazing group of women. Today, you're in for a treat as you will be presented with a discussion and with the founder and associates of the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security organization, Ambassador Dr. Bonnie Jenkins. The panel will cover the connections between global and domestic security threats and how the issues directly impact women of color. Our panel will be moderated by our own Dr. Chiedo Nwankwa, as we all call Dr. Chichi. She's in the back. Let's wave at Dr. Nwankwa. So Dr. Nwankwa teaches African politics with a focus on gender issues and women's political participation at SICE. Dr. Nwankwa also serves as the director of the SICE Women Lead program here at SICE. Dr. Nwankwa has also been an amazing and wonderful supporter of all the events that the SICE Diversity Council launches. She is a champion for diversity and inclusion at SICE, and I just thank her personally for being here. We are so excited that a member of our own community is here to celebrate such an important event. So Dr. Chichi, you can come right on down. Our panel also includes a great list of women running the world. As I call their name, I invite each of them to come and take a seat on the stage. Maritza Adonis, she is the Chief Executive Officer at MTA Visions, the world's first corporate social responsibility and government relations firm, and founder of the Society of Global Impact Entrepreneurs, incubator, accelerator, and support group for entrepreneurs committed to solving tomorrow's global problems today. Welcome, we're so happy to have you. Cara Hernandez is a bilingual program strategist who focuses on the nexus of international security and technology. Over the past 6 years, she's worked in Central America on international security, conventional weapons, and science diplomacy. Welcome, we're so happy to have you. Christina Lee currently serves as a senior advisor in the Center of Faith and Opportunity Initiatives. She is an innovative thinker, practitioner who is committed to win-win solutions. Her experiences are diverse, ranging from risk analysis at a Fortune 500 firm to grassroots microfinance work to U.S. government grants management and policy making. Welcome, Christina. Joyce Williams, managing attorney at Armu Williams, PLLC, a global boutique law firm in Alexandria, Virginia. Joyce focuses her practice on immigration law and project finance. Her previous experience includes working at the International Law Institute in Washington, D.C., United Nations Commission on International Trade Law in South Korea, and the Kozolczyk National Law Center in Tucson, Arizona. Welcome to all of you. Let's give them all a great hand. So I'm also introducing our keynote speaker, Ambassador Dr. Bonnie Jenkins. Ambassador Jenkins is the founder and executive director of Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. From 2009 to 2017, she was an ambassador at the U.S. Department of State, where she was a coordinator for threat reduction programs. She was also the U.S. representative to the G7 Global Partnership and the DOS lead to the Nuclear Security Summits. Jenkins was also a leading U.S. official in the launch and implementation of the Global Health Security Agenda and led engagement efforts with governments and the non-governmental sector. She established the GHSA Next Generation Network, the GHSA Consortium, and assisted in the establishment of the GHSA Private Sector Roundtable. She was the 2016 DOS International Security and Non-Proliferation Bureau's nominee for the Securities Award for Excellence in International Security Affairs. Jenkins was a program officer at the Ford Foundation and a counsel on the National Commission on Terrorist Acts upon the United States 9/11 Commission. Jenkins worked at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in the Office of General Counsel and is a retired Naval Reserves officer. She holds a PhD from the University of Virginia, an LLM from Georgetown University, an MPA from the State University of New York at Albany, a JD from Albany Law School, and a BA from Amherst College. She was also a fellow at the Belfer Center at John F. Kennedy School at Harvard University, and during that time, Jenkins also worked at the Bernard Cotin Office of Public Interest Advising at Harvard Law School. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins.
Hi, thanks for that really nice introduction. Hello, it's great to see all of you here. It's great to see the amazing panelists, and I know that you're going to have a wonderful discussion. I want to thank Johns Hopkins for hosting this with us, the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security organization. And I've been able to have the opportunity to do a number of other co-hostings with Johns Hopkins SICE, so I want to thank all of you for continuing to be such nice hosts for us to do some of our programs. I don't know if you had a chance to see some of the, we have a couple of flyers out there that talks a little bit about the organization, and I hope you can take some before you leave. I do want to apologize since this one didn't come out as nicely as I would have liked, but the information is still there. Just very briefly, the reason why, just a little bit about the organization and about the discussion. I established the organization exactly 2 years ago. This is our second anniversary. And really I established it because I got a little tired of being by myself. For so many years, I worked on issues of weapons of mass destruction, so hard security, and then started working on infectious disease issues toward the end of my time during the Obama administration. And I started working on these issues in the early 90s. And there are a lot more women now than there were when I started, though there still need to be more. Very few people of color, if any, and still very few in the field. And I got tired of being by myself. And I said, when I retire, in the future, who's coming behind me to kind of take over some of these things and share some of these experiences? I'm very happy to say, as I said, there are a lot more women in the field, a lot of young women who are working in the field of international security, particularly hard security. And SICE, of course, is doing a great job of molding future leaders who are young women in the future. But also I wanted to see what I could do to increase the number of people of color and also women of color in the field. So I established the organization as soon as I left the administration in January 2017. I took about 4 months off just to figure out where I was because I was very exhausted. And I decided to start the organization. And it's been great. Like I said, it's been 2 years, and I get to do a lot of these kind of things, which is have host panels, and the number of women that I have met in the last 2 years more than quadrupled the number of women, particularly women of color, who I've worked with when I was, all those years I was working in the government and outside the government. So that in itself has been rewarding, if nothing else. So being able to develop a network, and as you see from the organization, when you get a chance to see the flyer, we do quite a few things, and really we focus on young women, mid-career women, and the institutions, and trying to deal with the culture of trying to change and get more women and more people of color into some of these fields of international security and foreign policy. So we do everything from podcasts and webinars, we do trainings, we do events like these, we have a number of working groups. I think Kara's going to tell you a little about one that we're starting. We have 3 working groups already. One that's focusing on chemical, biological, nuclear, chemical weapons, which is what I do. We have one on cybersecurity and emerging technologies. We have one on climate change. We're starting another one on global health, and Kara will tell you about another one that we're doing. But that's an opportunity for folks to really focus in on some substantive areas that they really care about. The work of the organization does focus on peace, security, and conflict transformation. So of course it includes national security issues, but also some of these other issues that I've mentioned. So we look at all types of peace and security with the goal of trying to increase the diverse voices in these fields, but also to understand the connections between these fields and the connections between some of these issues like climate change and food and water security and the oceans and biodiversity and everything up to the hard security stuff. So it's really a great way to network. We do real work in terms of trainings. We have media trainings. We have leadership trainings. We even have, like yesterday, we had an opportunity for one of our board members just to host a call to anyone who wanted to call in and ask questions about career challenges. How do you juggle career and professional life in a field that's mainly predominantly men? So we really tried to answer the needs of the members. This conversation, which is focusing on redefining or rethinking national security, is one of the initiatives of the organization. It really focuses on whether the definitions of national security that we have today really adequately reflects the challenges that a lot of us face around the world, and whether the definition is really one that's stuck in the Cold War and doesn't really take into account the challenges that women and people of color face around the world, but also in the U.S. And what are we missing by not having a more comprehensive definition that doesn't include things like climate change or adequately reflects infectious disease issues. These are issues that are not only global, but they're also very domestic. And if we're not really focusing on these issues, that means there's not money being put towards them, there's not an emphasis being put toward them, and there's not priority by our parts of the government. So it looks at those issues and also looks at how we can redefine it by just including different voices. And so we've had a number of these discussions. We have them around the U.S., and so this is a great opportunity to have one here in Johns Hopkins. So I think that's all I'm going to say because I really don't want to take time away from the great panel that you're going to be listening to. And so I just want to say thank you again for coming. Thank you to Johns Hopkins for hosting another event with WCAPS. We really like these joint events. I hope that we can continue these in the future. So thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And welcome. Thank you for being here. So the focus of this panel is on global security threats and their impact on women of color here in the United States and around the world. It also highlights the links between global and domestic security threats, and a recognition that global threats have impacts, impacts on national security here in the United States as Americans, and also for women around the world. We know that, galloping technological advances, right, has supersized the effects of globalization, right? And so these have kind of forced the world into a relationship that's akin to a global community, right? One that offers a few exit options, if any at all. All right, so this changing landscape, right, of new relationships brings with it new challenges, new security challenges, right, new threats. As cultures and governments and economies, right, are drawn into new and changing patterns of relationships, they present evolving security threats, that has significant implications for not just only the states, but also individuals, right? Individuals in the Bayou of Louisiana, in the skyscrapers of Japan, right, and New York City, and also in the hinterlands of Africa, right? So we're all connected. And so if this be the case, as Ambassador Jenkins said, we cannot continue to carry our notions of national security, right? Our definitions of national security, we have to rethink those. And so seated with me today are these experts, lovely experts, who will be helping us rethink, right? Articulate what we mean or what our new conceptions of national security should be. When we say we're rethinking national security, what do we mean? What does that entail, right? And how do we as individual actors and as state agents rethink, what do we contribute to that discourse, to that conversation? So I think we'll start here at the panel and go for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, if the House agrees on that. Okay, so I think to start, I'll start with you, Joyce, if that's okay. So tell us about the work you do. Right? How does your work connect to both the global and the local, right? And how do you consider the work you do at this point? How does it impact national security?
Thank you, Shishi, and thank you for all of you for being here, and John Hopkins for hosting this. So I am an attorney, and I focus my practice on immigration law and project finance, and I will keep this discussion on immigration law. The immigration deals with the movement of people, and you cannot have security bigger than the movement of people. Whether it is forced migration, which is asylees and refugees, or voluntary migration of educated or low-skill level individuals who are trying to move around. So in terms of connecting the work that I do, I want to look at it from 3 standpoints. From the security standpoint, you have issues of criminal behavior, you have issues of like terrorism, conflict, espionage, and all those big topics that falls under national security. And anytime that there is a communication or there is a transfer of people across borders, it carries those implications with them. In addition to that, you have the social aspect where people travel just for the cultural experience and just to get to know other places in the world for their own educational or pleasure. And then we have the interconnectedness of global business, where business is no longer local. You can have someone small in the apartment doing business, but with several people around the world, whether it's selling things online or having arts displays around the world. So movement of people poses a lot of security threats. And domestically, I think that if we look at the US policies on immigration, starting from beginning, it's been going through different kind of phases, but it starts from a policy of more of an exclusive than inclusive policy. So at any point in time, it is this group of people. You can come to the US if you meet X, Y, and Z. You cannot come if you don't meet this criteria. So the eligibility criteria, whether it's for visas for family, visas for asylees, refugees, have always had criteria that excludes some people. And that itself is not a bad thing, because you cannot have everybody, and whatever the policy is going to be, it cannot include everybody. But looking at it in the 21st century and the challenges that we face in the global world, I think that an immigration policy that looks, number one, the security aspect, the economic aspect, and then the social and cultural exchanges benefit of immigration is comprehensive. And that serves the purpose both in the interest of the national security of people and the country and public safety than policy that is rooted in years ago. I think that currently one of the two areas that is of concern when you look at immigration and how that impacts women, both within the US and around the world, is a decision that was issued during the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, reducing, for instance, asylum claims for women who have suffered domestic violence around the world. And domestic violence continues to be a huge problem around the world, and plus in the United States. And so by eroding the rights of such women to be able to present themselves to seek relief, we condemn those women into a life of pain, servitude, and vulnerability that they don't see any avenue outside of that. The second decision, which was recently issued by the Attorney General, Barr, talks about a particular social group in asylum, and women, mostly from Central America, from war-torn zones, have always been considered vulnerable enough to be able to apply for asylum in that particular. And by narrowing the factors for a particular social group, it becomes very difficult. So those are some of the challenges that women around the world are facing within the current universe of asylum and immigration policies. And I will stop here. We will continue. So, yeah.
Thank you. Christina, do you want to take it from there?
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon, I guess. I'm currently an advisor at USAID. I've been seconded to USAID from the U.S. Department of State, where prior to this current role that focuses on religious freedom, I was looking at the role of religious engagement. I know that when you get into academic circles or when you get into sector-specific areas, we get super wonky with the way that we think about things and start making these very small distinctions. But one way that I would think about my prior role would be to engage with religious leaders and religious communities globally, out of the recognition that many times a lot of the strongest partners that we have are faith-based organizations. Currently at the U.S. Agency for International Development, I look at religious freedom more as a human right? And I think that that's absolutely fundamental in terms of the way that we view ourselves, the way that we orient the world. And I think a lot of times when we do consider these questions about national security, we've oftentimes looked at it as what negative role does religion play in all of this. However, I think when you look at the religious engagement side, I think that's where you see in some of the most difficult contexts globally, when people are running away, you actually have religious leaders who are so devoted to their communities staying there. And so, so I think there are different ways to consider this issue of religion, where religion in itself would be agnostic, right? Religion is a way of orientation, and then the way that the US government then engages with it is by looking at it as a very important part of civil society. And one thing that I really appreciate, and by the way, even though I am speaking about our government, I am speaking in my personal capacity. But the reason why our government does engage on issues of religion and with religious leaders isn't necessarily because we care about religion, right? There's the establishment clause within our Constitution, which is to protect every individual's right to choose what they believe. And we don't want for the government to have too much of a strong hand in that. However, when our government does look at religious leaders and does partner with them, it's because we care about civil society and supporting civil society. And it's out of the recognition that religious leaders are very fundamental leaders within civil society that we partner with them. And so I think that going back to the national security question, then I would say, again, these are fundamental questions to every person, and this is what makes us human. Who are we? How do we orient the world? And I think that when there are things that prevent for that flourishing, then people start looking to other ways to start engaging. And depending on what's around and what influences are around, then I think that that may result in things that we then look at from a national security perspective, or it can be tremendously beneficial. And so, I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Hi, yes. So my name is Kara. So previous to this role that I am doing now, I worked at the Embassy of Costa Rica here in Washington, D.C. So I am a U.S.-born citizen, and my family's from Mexico. So just to kind of have that as a different layer of what my background was. So I was living in Costa Rica, working on arms trade and working on drug trafficking and working in women's prisons. So I had kind of a little bit of a citizen security background before coming to the embassy. And I kind of steal this from Anne-Marie Slaughter, this idea of this chessboard versus the web when it comes to diplomacy. Because I think when people think of diplomats, they think it's like negotiations and dark paneled rooms and all of these things. And it is that. It is these strategic power plays, trying to avoid conflict, but also not shying away from it when needed. And then my role, since I'm not a Costa Rican citizen, was more of kind of like this web-based thing of how our new way of diplomacy is working, where if you want to talk to the citizens of the Ukraine, you don't necessarily have to talk to the ambassador. You can speak to them directly now in this digital age. And how do you do that? So coming as, in my earlier life in college, as a community organizer, that was actually much more helpful to me in this role as being strategic and engaging people, and engaging citizens and building connections. Because you obviously, ambassadors go and they'll talk to, they're based in the capital, but they talk to businesses, they'll talk to nonprofits. But you don't really see them talking and engaging with citizens. So from the flip side of this, in the Costa Rican embassy trying to engage with the US, it's enormous, it's massive. It's too big. You can't really get that across. So my job was to figure out creative ways through science diplomacy, through academia, through nonprofits, through media campaigns, how to engage and build those kinds of action. And so after I left the embassy, I still do that, but more on a kind of a diversity and inclusion front as well as a security front. So I have actually worked with WCAPS on a toolkit to really how to get foreign policy institutions to hire more inclusively, have a little bit more diversity in their ranks, and what the really impacts of that are. On the other side of my more security work that I do, it's how security work, I will planning a conference that will have a lot of foreign-born natives coming and talking to security experts here in the US to talk about how security is transnational now. So even if it's physical security, a lot of people, we do a lot of cyber, but how that is, because in my opinion, Latin America not only is everything is international and domestic at the same time, because geographically it's very close. So a natural disaster, or it could be illegal fishing. Our oceans are very important to this. It could be trafficking of humans. It could be illegal migration. It can be all of these things, as well as not only the trade. So everything is kind of connected. And then you also have people who have familiar ties to the region, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it has a political ramifications of who people vote for because of those ties. So there's all of these things, kind of how international politics and international foreign affairs affect politicians. And Florida is a really great case when it comes to Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, because 2/3 of the Venezuelans coming into the country are in Florida. So Florida's really leading the charge. They're not only leading the charge, but they're really leading the charge and have been since the very beginning. So you kind of see how these domestic and international things play together in Latin America so much more closely. I'm biased, obviously, in these ways, because it really is everything. And science diplomacy is a really big one with renewable energies, with infectious diseases, how things travel. There's so many different ways of how Latin America and the U.S. are purely domestic and international concerns and national security concerns for the region. So every time I'm at a conference like this, I'm like, Latin America. Remember Latin America. Please think about Latin America. So that's my...
Awesome. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maritza Adonis. Thank you so much, Ambassador Bonnie, for your vision for this program, and of course, John Hopkins for hosting us today. And as our introducer mentioned, I am the Chief Executive Officer of MTA Visions. We're the first corporate social responsibility and government relations firm. And what that means is that we're tying the two industries together because we found that whether it's energy, healthcare, government, you need both private and public to work together. And the way that this came about was in my law firm in London. So my background is I'm an attorney. I concentrated in international arbitration, so the commercial investments. And one day while working with one of our clients, my role with our clients is to serve as an arbitrator or a judge for their respective cases. And our clients typically come to us when there is a failed investment dispute between that country and X corporation. And during one of the deliberations, as we were coming up with our decisions for them, I realized that there were 3 or 4 main things that really stuck out as to why we were in this situation to begin with. One was communication. A lot of times when stakeholders come into agreement, they're not communicating. They're sending a liaison to make that deal for them. And so, but when it's time for the dispute, by court of law, that CEO has to show up, and that Minister of Foreign Affairs, or sometimes that the president of that country has to show up. And so a lot of times what I saw with my cases was that those were the first time that those two stakeholders were coming together. The communication was a running theme. The second thing was cultural competency. A lot of these stakeholders had no idea how each other's culture impacted their respective businesses and then flowed into the communities that they were serving. And finally, the other major thing that I found that stood out to me was community. Although the respective corporations were coming into a country and making investments, they did not see themselves identifying as a member of that community. They were making global investments, they had global headquarters, but X corporation, who maybe was founded in Seattle, identified more so as a person from Seattle versus seeing themselves as a global citizen. And so when I left that post, or actually when I was recruited from Lithuania to come back to DC, I said, well, if I'm gonna come back to DC and be amongst all the stakeholders here, being in that specific unique lens, I need to find a solution for this. And so that's how MTA Visions came to be, where I said, well, you know, I've had access to both public and private stakeholders. I see what the issues are. I know I can create a vehicle that can help avoid some of these disputes, which then flows into national security concerns. And so for our firm, we're about 4.5 years old, and so our clientele initially started off with a couple of countries who were looking to protect their respective interests into the United States. From that, we then expanded to representing Fortune 500s, where we started working on the government relations sector, a lot of regulatory and compliance, which then spun into the corporate social responsibility sectors, whether it was helping them to actually build a CSR unit, or to help them merge an existing unit that needed to merge, or interestingly enough, help them to define what corporate social responsibility actually is. And so from that, we then created our international division last year, which is where a lot of the national security starts to overlap, where we saw, and I think you guys mentioned, Kara mentioned how, you know, she saw that as a community organizer, the biggest impact was having that direct access one-on-one versus having to sit down with an ambassador. And so we created a citizen diplomacy service for our corporations and our elected officials who are looking to either do business from the economic sector, looking to connect their residents from a social and cultural perspective. And literally a lot of times what it is just planning events like this, where they get to sit down off the record and just have humane conversations. Or we'll host a dinner where they get to share an experience with each other's cuisines. And then through that, you know, the next day when they do have to sit down and make those tough decisions, they're in a better posture to make those decisions. So really excited to be here on this panel. Look forward to sharing a bit more about the intersections between public, private sectors, both local, statewide, nationally, and internationally.
Okay, well, thank you. So maybe, Christina, we're rethinking national security, right? What exactly does that entail? Right? What do we mean by rethinking national security?
Well, I think that we should always be rethinking constantly, right? We work or we live and we work in a ever-changing world, right? We have even AI, the robots, and technology is moving so quickly. And so if we don't adapt in the way that we approach particular problem sets, no matter what our various sectors are, then I don't think that will be relevant anymore. And so in terms of national security, if you think about the overlays of the ways that technology has impacted, I was speaking earlier about our identities, right, and religious freedom and all of these things. Well, one thing that I was really struck by in terms of ways that some of these terrorist organizations were recruiting were how incredibly bespoke they were, right? That if you had someone who was living in a rural area and feeling very lonely, right, then they would have recruiters who were able to specifically talk to that person. They were able to become friends with that person, to draw them into this international but not physical community, and then attract them to join these various causes, right? And so this is something that would have been very difficult many, many years ago, but when we think about these issues that we have to tackle, then I think in order to truly understand how these sectors are evolving, then we have to constantly be rethinking and to be out of that awareness of how on the ground the situations are evolving.
Okay, thank you. And Joyce, so again, so what do we mean? Can you map the contours of rethinking national security and how that impacts women of color?
So I think that in my universe of work and then my background as an immigrant myself, I think that as Christina was saying, we have to constantly be rethinking about this. But in terms of how it impacts women in our national security thinking, and I think that when Ambassador Jenkins was giving her opening, she mentioned when you think of national security, you think about the Cold War and the spy and all those things. But it's as basic as a woman living anywhere else. I think last week there was a girl in Nairobi who had committed suicide because she had her period at school, and the teacher embarrassed her in front of the whole class. And not having access or reach to understanding some of these issues, it leaves a lot of people vulnerable. And as Christina was alluding to, vulnerability is one of the easiest way to get people to really do anything, whatever that you want. So I think that we live in a world that we are connected, but there is also a vacuum in terms of the loneliness that people feel, the cutoff of information. In some countries, there are taxes on social media use. So if you're using your phone for social media, the government is taxing you. One of them is Tanzania recently, and I believe Uganda as well. So you have all these issues that leaves people outside of the connectedness of the universe. So when we are thinking of national security, we cannot think local. We cannot think only about the United States. We have to think about the impact of people who are outside of the United States and how their lives and their environments can impact that. You have terrorist groups that move around all the time, whether it's Boko Haram, having operations here. I deal with project finance, and when you do due diligence for financial institution and how money gets moved around, it is very complicated and it's very tedious, and people find creative way of moving money to people and getting people engaged in things that you'll be sitting in Washington and not thinking that this is happening, but it is happening. So our governments and our policy leaders cannot look at national security just in terms of everybody has an ID, social security, we have our fingers printed, so we are good. It has to go beyond the people who are living outside of the United States and what technology can do to connect them and impact the way that security affects the country.
Okay, thank you very much. And so, Kara, so we're here talking about rethinking national security, right? Some would say it's a little presumptuous, right? Because we are obviously not engaging the texts, right? We're not engaging, we're not at this point contributing to the conversations that are had before texts like UN Resolution 1325, right? Or the US Women, Peace and Security Act, or any of these other policy documents that actually stipulates our engagement with national security and global security. So we are adding our voices. Who cares, right? Why do we care? Why should we care about women of color's voices, right, are being layered onto these conversations, onto these discourses, even at this level?
So to kind of go back to what I was talking about with the web, I don't mean like the internet web, I mean like a web of connectivity. And the more we talk about it, the more connections that we're making, because to be powerful in a web, you can't be on top of it, you have to be in the center. So I think the more we talk to each other, the more we're connecting with each other, and that is where the power comes. So it might not be me, Kara, making this huge movement in national policy and how people think about these things, but it's what I can do to put somebody on this panel, somebody in this group together with somebody else to really create that power dynamic. So for me, I think it feels, I have days where I'm like, nobody cares. Nobody cares. I had days when I felt nobody cared at the embassy, because we're looking at power like this, which is still the traditional way to do it. It's still useful, it's still helpful, but this way of connecting this way really will bring and center this kind of power and dynamic. And I also think when we're rethinking it, we're not thinking about younger people and their relationships to like 9/11, for example, because I was fairly young when 9/11 happened. I remember it. I didn't have an adult brain to kind of really understand what was happening at the time. But now you see even younger people coming in and thinking, why are we there? Why did this happen? Like, they have a different context, a different idea of that. So I think bridging this up together will make waves that I think I see in DC changing from when I first got to DC in 2012 to now. I do see the conversations different. I do see the partners who we worked with at even at Southern Command are changing, and the discourse is changing. Is it fast? No, it's not as sexy as a UN resolution, to be honest, but then at the same time, we would train Cuban activists in Costa Rica on the UN Human Rights Treaty, and how to lobby for things and how to do it. And that still is hard. But still, even though there's a treaty, even though there's all these mechanisms, you still need these conversations one-on-one. And that's I think, which is why the internet is not the only solution, why this chessboard way of diplomacy is not the solution. I think mentorship, to be honest, and this type of conferences are what really make the difference, especially for women of color. Because I know I used to feel like, I don't deserve to be in this room. So,
Well,
yeah.
You deserve to be in this room. I can tell you that.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
So thank you. So if you take a look, you'd see that the room is diverse, right? How would you imagine people that don't identify as women of color, right, to be part of this conversation? Or is this just a conversation that we, right, self-identified should be having by ourselves? Or do you think might we be preaching to the choir, right? So how do you imagine that we could, people that do not identify as women of color could be, could bring some purchase to this conversation?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. So the first thing that I would tell them is, imagine that you get sick or you have a loved one that's sick and they need blood, right? And the doctor says, this is the blood that we have available to you. Will your first question be, is that a woman? Is that a man? Is that a woman of color? It's a life-saving thing, right? And so we need to start shifting women of color issues, all issues, and to make that be into one, because we're one. We're one species of humans. That's the first thing I would tell them. Give them a basic example of, some life-saving example. How do we bring more actors into a room like this, right? Ambassador Bonnie did a great job with some marketing, and John Hopkins did as well too. Is to help them see what stake they have in it, right? Because of course, women of color issues are our interest issues, and so in order to invite others to the table, we need to say, well, here's the table that we're building. This is what's on the menu. Here's where you fit in, whether it's in the main course or the dessert option, or even if it's not at the table. The fact that we're meeting, this may impact you, because the decision that we may make at the table may later trickle down, whether it's in your personal life or your business life. And so one, it would be to find creative ways to help them identify with our issues. It could be as simple as, taking this panel on tour, right? There's quite a few universities in the DMV area. John Hopkins, I'm pretty sure, has some great relationships, maybe connecting with some of their academic departments and saying, hey, we would love to bring this to your university. And then from there, that catches the bug. As an older millennial, something that's hashtagable, I don't know if that's a word or not, but a campaign that you can put on social media, right? We have, when you see pink ribbon, you automatically think of what?
Breast cancer.
Breast cancer, right? So if, women of color and national security, we're trying to really make this a campaign and we want it to become a standard, then perhaps we need WCAPS can, adding another thing to Ambassador Bonnie's to-do list. WCAPS could come up with a campaign. Maybe it's thinking of random color purple, right? So that, as folks start to see purple, they identify, women of color issues, national security, and then tie it back to myself as a human, which then connects back to, some of the things that I saw repeatedly in these disputes was the sense of, yes, I'm doing investments here, but I'm not a part of the community. And so more often than not, helping, whether it was elected official or that private sector representative realize that, yes, you're providing a service to that community. You are very much a part of that community. Yes, you may not, put that item together, but that supply chain, you're very much responsible for that. Therefore, you are, responsible for that community. So with that, I would say, really to recruit more diverse stakeholders into the conversation is to, one, show them where they fit. And then two, like anything that works these days, create a really good snazzy campaign to get folks on board.
Thank you very much. I think I have about 20 more questions, but at this point, we're just going to throw it open so that, the audience can get in a couple questions. So please introduce yourself, and then you can ask questions. Please.
So I can speak a little bit about that. In my last role, we did a lot of science diplomacy because even if countries are in a dispute or in trouble, or there's a lot of, U.S. cuts off financial aid or does an embargo, there's still scientific innovation and STEM innovation coming through the borders. Sometimes it might be in the conference is not in either of those countries, but it still is happening quite often. You see that a lot with Cuba and the U.S., and you see that in the Middle East in the US. Like you do see that quite often. I do think it's always really important if you are really interested in a specific type of national security to think about the other actors. So like AAAS is a good one. I think it's the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They have a science diplomacy fellowship, and they bring people in from all over the world, and they actually go to different embassies. The ambassador hosted them once. I do think it's a really important push that nobody really talks about. Sometimes, so I worked with a university, I won't name names, and they would take their scientists and their academics and take them to DC, and they would do a 2-day-long training for 1 day lobbying, because they're like, you need to learn how to talk to these people. It's a different language over here. And I do think that is some of the issue, because you see that with cybersecurity too. So with cybersecurity, IT technologists are using the same words as lawyers, but they're so vastly different meanings. So I do think there is a great divide. I don't know of anybody who's really tackling really well. In the security conference that I work on, we do bring in people from different areas, and we do a workshop and like a glossary, to be honest. Like we go down to the basics to say, if I'm saying this word, if you're a lawyer, you're gonna think it's this. And if you're an IT technologist, you're gonna think it's this. So I do think it is really hard, and sometimes you just have to go back to like a basics. And I think every conference should have like a workshop on things like that. That's something I always want to put out there, because we're doing this agenda for this conference, and that's my big pitch. Well, and that's also another thing. So for especially certain items like that, a lot of things are not manufactured in the U.S. So there also needs to be people from, private sector there too, because what was happening is Costa Rica's number one thing is medical devices. Medical devices are now easily hacked, and you see that a lot, especially with the military. So you see a lot of these attacks. So there are a lot of issues that way. I don't know anybody really doing a great job. I think what AAAS is doing is really great. I don't think any national security people have really truly made strides into connecting them. Yeah. And you also don't know if it's going to work at the end of the day when it comes to things like AI. Is it really going to, not work, that's not a good word. Is it really going to be as profitable as the amount of money it needs to do to implement it? I mean, the US government didn't have like computers in all of its offices up until like 10 years ago, which is crazy. Computers have been everywhere. So there's just things like that. Like if you can't get a computer in somebody's office, how can you get an AI into large scale when it comes to national security? But we can talk later. I have another thing about Silicon Valley I want to talk to you about. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That was great. We'll take more questions. Yes. Yes, please. The microphone.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. A few months ago, I was speaking with the president of the Supreme Court of Ethiopia, who happens to be a woman. And she was telling me how like she felt like disrespected at a lot of like the major events within her country, just because of the way that her society is structured, just with like male dominance and everything. So like a few weeks after that, several people were hit with, fully automatic rifles, around the prime minister's office, and including the chief military strategist of Ethiopia recently. So I was wondering if anyone had any advice for that young lady over there who's trying to build a Supreme Court program in her nation currently. Thank you very much.
Bonnie, I think you might want to take that.
Allies. You know, I mean, a lot of times you can't do something if you feel like you're the, well, you could do something, but it's more likely that you'll be successful at something and you can find allies. And they don't always have to be other women. They could be allies who are men, who are supportive of what you want to do. So you want to have a group of people or someone who you can say, or a group of people who you can rely on, who could be your support system. And so I think it would be not just in this situation with the Supreme Court, but I think in a situation like this for a woman trying to make a difference in a situation where it's a male-dominated field, you want to be able to find a support system. You want to be able to find people who are supportive of what you want to do. For example, in my situation, when I started this organization, you know, there wasn't anything like this in terms of being a network of women of color in the area of peace, security, and conflict transformation. There were little things that were like it, something like in smaller pieces, but nothing like this. And so I always had questions from people about, we know there's women of color out there doing work in cyber, or a lot of women in New York who work on peace issues at the UN, and, you know, but we don't know who they are, and we can't connect with them, and we can't reach them. We don't, and if we need somebody on a panel, we don't know who to reach out to. So the way I started it was I talked to people. I talked to women who I knew, and I said, what do you think about this idea of trying to develop this network, this organization, for something that I've wanted to do for a long time? And by having people who I talked to who were supportive of me, we thought through how to make this happen. You know, and so a lot of times, you know, when you're going upstream, it's hard enough going upstream, but it's a little easier if you have people kind of at your side who are going upstream with you and pushing the water with you. And then you find more people who can jump on. And then it's a lot easier to go against the tide if you got other people with you. So, but it may not always be in my case, it may not always be other women of color. It may be people who are supportive of the idea, believe in the mission, and want to see success. So not knowing her situation and not knowing who her support would be, that would be the first thing. And then working together, you can make things happen.
Yeah, I actually would like to add to that because that's my daily struggle, especially being a CEO of a company that does global work. The clients that I sit in front of are typically ambassadors, the chief executive officers of Fortune 500 companies. And I had to learn early on to get over myself, right? To one, understand that I've earned my place in the room, and that I had to teach them how to treat me. Because what I also found over time was that a lot of times the room is so used to being the room that when you come in there, they don't even realize that they might be treating you the way that they're treating you, or not acknowledging that you're there. It's not necessarily something that they're doing intentionally, but sometimes you have to go in there and, let's say, for example, two men are having a conversation, right? But you come in, you introduce yourself, another comes in and cuts you off. You might have to say, hi, excuse me, since you've cut off our conversation, introduce yourself, kind of a thing. And so my recommendation to her would be is to, one, stand firm, two, work on herself internally, because a lot of times if we work on ourselves internally to tell ourselves that, yes, I have earned my space in this room, that helps us to be a little bit more comfortable in this space. And then three, to teach them how to treat you honestly, you know? And so, and Godspeed to her as well too.
And so if I might just quickly add something else. We are talking about a context that is different from the context that we have out here, right? We're talking about Ethiopia. And so, like Bonnie was saying, she needs allies. And research has shown that in patriarchal contexts, you need male allies, right? So she needs to reach out to male allies. And most of the time, these male allies are the patronage networks, right, that connects the parties and, the government at each point in time, right? So it's been done before. It's a tough task, but what she really needs to do is, like you said, I don't want to say get over herself, because I wouldn't even take the job if they gave it to me, knowing what she's dealing with. But right, is to establish male allies within the parties, within the ruling party, and within the stronger of the opposing parties, and then also using those to also reach out to regional blocs, regional organizations, because typically outside of domestic power patrons, the next actor that usually within this context have relevance and have influence are regional actors. For example, the Sadiq, right? Now she could also get this within these other actors or groups that they have popping up in ECOWAS and the rest of it. We'll take more questions. Yes, can we give to the gentleman, please?
I can probably so, I'm walking by the first year MA student here at SICE, and one of the things I'm interested in hearing is Kara, you mentioned you built a toolkit on team building and the effect of having more diverse teams, and I think maybe I misunderstood you. So there's sort of two parts to that question, and the first is like, and one thing I think people can come together on is the fact that diverse teams are stronger and more adaptable. So number one, and then number two, when you look at what does right look like in building diverse teams and sort of being an advocate for having women qualify on your team, how do you, so number one, quantify, number two, what does right look like in team building?
Are those questions?
Everybody,
I will, first of all, let me check with Bonnie that I should be able to, it's not published yet. We're publishing a month or two?
We're still working.
It's out in a month or two, where hopefully we'll be out, so be on the lookout for that. I think what is really interesting and what I really wanted to put into how to build a diversity, like a DEI group and to build diversity is also what you do, because you're gonna find issues. And so we have a section on crisis management and red flags, because that's the biggest barrier that you're gonna be finding. And it could just be one malcontent, but if they have so much cultural influence in the building, if you come into work every day and someone goes, that girl sucks, every day, you're gonna be like, she does suck. Like, she's not qualified to be here. Like, I don't like this person, she's too loud, like, whatever. I think that's what's really a big part of it that's really not talked about enough is the crisis management and red flags and what to do when you do have a problem. Because if your culture is, like, nothing so happens just to be 95%, one gender or one race. It doesn't just happen to be like that. It's something that's happening on an internal level. So I think you're gonna find issues. And how to deal with those issues is the bigger part to building diversity, is what to do with, you're not necessarily gonna have to fire people. But sometimes you do. Sometimes you have to say, this is, and you really need strong leadership. You need depending on what your organization is built like, you need somebody that is like, hold their ethics and is a very strong leader ethically to really, and it doesn't have to be the CEO sometimes, because sometimes they have to make harsh decisions. So it might be your COO, or it might be your human resources person, but I think that's really a big part of it.
You have a question?
Ali, I'm a second-year MA student here at Johns Hopkins SICE. And Maritza, my question is for you. You mentioned your experience as an international arbitration attorney, and that was kind of the inspiration behind your company, seeing how people, like clients, would get into the problems that you were trying to help them solve. So one of the interesting comments that you made was that a lot of the times the clients would say that they didn't feel like they were part of the communities that you guys were trying to help them understand. And I'm wondering if you can kind of shed some more light into that comment and how exactly you were able to help them, like, understand and like figure out how they can empathize and relate to the communities that they felt they couldn't.
Yeah, definitely. And think about a corporation, right? There's a C-suite, like your chief executive officer, chief operation officer, and they might have 50,000 employees, right? Regional offices. That C-suite, 99% of the time, is not connected to what's the end product. So I'll give a example. Holly Mart, I don't want to use a real company that we work with. Holly Mart, right? CEO of Holly Mart has 110,000 employees domestically, maybe another 400,000 abroad. Total, 1 million employees. C-suite's probably about a team of 15. Those 15 then have another 20 regional offices. 20 regional offices have another 60 offices. It's like it's a chain pattern, right? That C-suite communicates with each other, just amongst each other, and they pass it down to their respective, the next person in line. But Holly Mart, what they do is they produce cell phones, right? A consumer in, let's say, country of Greenland. What is that actual country?
Yeah.
I don't want to use real Orangeland country.
Yeah.
Orangeland country. There's a consumer that's there that's purchasing the cell phone. So, but when there's a dispute over the cell phone, let's say the country of Orangeland entered into an agreement with Holly Mart and said, yes, we will allow you to sell 1 billion cell phones into our economy. 3 months go by, cell phones are blowing up, consumers are losing their right hand, right? Enters into a dispute. Typically, larger stakeholders enter into what's called an arbitration. It's international arbitration for us because I don't say international, but it's countries and corporations typically are like foreign entities. When they enter into that, that's the only time that C-suite person catches wind that there's something wrong with their device, right? And even then, it's probably like a one-page brief because they have a general counsel and someone else they're sending to come there. But when it comes to that first actual meeting, the CEO has to be present, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs has to also be present. For me, kind of coming from a quasi lens, and it has to do with a lot of my background. Raised in Miami, raised in a culturally diverse area, then coming to North Carolina for college, where for me, diversity looks like nations, and then in North Carolina, it turned into race, right? And so just diversity in my mindset, diversity of thought and how I was raised, coming into that space, my lens allowed me to see a different type of issue, where it was beyond that. The reason why the CEO didn't, in my opinion, right, as the arbitrator, the reason why that CEO did not take the time to make sure that the due diligence was there for that particular product is because they did not feel connected to that community. Because if the CEO knew that this product would go into the hands of a friend or a colleague, then they would have made sure, in a sense, that the quality was there. And so that's what the sense of community meant. And so for me, a lot of times as an arbitrator, you have a sense of autonomy to really guide them in terms of what that damage is going to look like. And so I had fun with it. Instead of saying, $3 billion to the country or $3 billion back to the corporation, I would say, oh, okay, $2 million of this needs to go to building schools. $1 million needs to go into helping with trainings. And then with all of my cases that I got to do, which I then translate into the work that I do as a consultant with my firm, was that I require CEOs and the C-suite to actually go on the ground. They have to go there. They live, they eat with the community folks. We have one program where they actually go into a particular store, if it's like a company that sells a particular item, and they serve as that manager for the day. So they get to actually interact with customers and see what it looks like day to day. And so that's where I kind of saw the disconnect. And so for me, it was because they didn't see themselves as part of the community. And sometimes they would say, well, I'm not connected to this community. Like, I'm not, but your product is. And if we can change that mindset, and that's where really helping them to define corporate social responsibility, it could help them to produce better products. Did I kind of answer your question? Okay.
So kind of add on to that question, right? Like, obviously you do a lot
Yeah, great question. So cultural competency trainings, I get those myself all the time. And by God's grace, we built our firm. We have 21 consultants. And so most of our consultants are regional and they speak the language, they understand the culture. And so a lot of times now, like, I don't necessarily have to be the one to go into, let's say, Africa, for example. We are very intentional when we enter into a contract to hire local. That's one thing that I said, when I go into business, I always hated walking into that room and they were selling X product and the team looked nothing like the product or the consumers they were serving. And so if we're doing a project in Africa, we're going to hire a local consultant that's there on the ground who's then informing us. We have cultural competency trainings. We also offer cultural competency trainings as well too. Every single trip that I go to, I've been to about 14 or 15 countries and worked in about 6. I have maybe 6 languages under my belt. I still get trained for every trip because things shift, right? The last 6 months, most of my work has been in Southeast Asia. And so every time I'm getting ready to go, we have our team, we get debriefed, what to wear, the colors to wear, how to speak, how to address, the different conversational sayings that we need to have. So for example, if a member on our team that's getting deployed to that particular assignment has no Mandarin, we teach them the basics like ni hao or ni hao ma, just to kind of show some sort of like respect and deference to that culture. But it works, the same thing that we're offering to our clients, we are also implementing that for us internally as well too. So cultural competency trainings.
But I think the fact that you're even asking that question is really good because ultimately I think it boils down to our interest in other people, right? And going back to this idea of religious freedom and looking at how people look at the world, how they organize their thoughts around how things work, I think that if we can fundamentally appreciate the dignity of other cultures and of other people, then we're already halfway there, right? Because we're at least aware, right? I think when they say about addictions, they say that the first step is recognizing that you have one, or the first step is recognizing that there's an issue. And so the fact that you're asking this means that you would be someone who would seek out those trainings that Maritza was talking about, or that in those other cultural contexts, you would be paying attention to how people are moving and positioning themselves in the room, and you would be responding to that. And so keep asking.
Good job, Will. Yes.
I have a question for Christina to find out, because we're talking about national security and peace, and I'm looking at the global perspective in terms of empirical studies have shown that women are indispensable for the peace process in countries in conflict and post-conflict countries. So I don't know if you just talk a little bit about that, especially with your experience with a State Department and USAID.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if women are 50% of a population and also have a specific perspective, then leaving them out of the peace process probably isn't going to be wise. And I think that, I guess this is where SLICE comes in and other academic institutions. I think there is a lot of hard technical research that shows this. And I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I think that they're also quite accessible.
I think I have one.
Yeah.
Just one. So if women, right, 13, UN Resolution 1325, right, based on the fact that if women are involved in peacemaking processes, right, conflict resolution processes, the probability for that peace, negotiated peace to last 15 years and more is higher if you have women as part of the deal than if you don't, right? I just thought maybe that's what you're asking, right?
Yeah. No, definitely, right. And so I think that the evidence is there, right? But I think, again, we're talking about these cultural norms, right? And even though there may be research and evidence that says one thing, if we're not within a decision-making culture where that is acknowledged, then that's where you have a disconnect. And that's where we have to start pushing, right, to ask people to re-examine those assumptions, or at least to, I use the word pushing because maybe we can't just wait. We have to assert ourselves and integrate ourselves into the process, and to share information that if we aren't in that room, then people wouldn't even know that, to even ask that, to know that that's a possibility. And so, yeah.
And so if I might just add to that quickly. So research shows, all right, so research shows that during war, right, in war times, men play mostly one type of role, right? They're combatants. But women wear several hats, right? They're combatants, they play support, they play back end, and then they also take care of the society, the family, right? And so in post-conflict building, right, rebuilding, because of course the war and conflict fundamentally destabilizes society, right? Norms change, identities change, and women really are at the base. Women bear the brunt of this. And so leaving women out of these post-conflict resolution processes, as research has shown, it quickly creates the platform or the ground for these negotiations to quickly unravel. That's one. Two, because women, society fundamentally changes, the stabilization, norms change. You have women, becoming things that they were not before the war, right? And so if this post-conflict society building is going to have any effect, is going to last, women will have to sit on the table to show the map, right? Create the map for, what the society is going to be, what should be allowed, what should not be allowed, because typically what happens is that we have male combatants, right, sitting down on the table and deciding what is and what is not. They have not been there. They've been in the bushes, right? They've been in the bushes doing all the things they do. We should have women that have been in society and actually taking care of society and be part of establishing and articulating what the post-conflict society should look like. I mean, there's a ton of research to back this up, right? We're out of time. Thank you so very much. This has been such great fun. Thank you so much, panelists, for coming. Thank you, SAIS community. You're always great. And this hopefully should be an ongoing society. Thank you, Bonnie. All right, thank you.